Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, Honorable President Contanescu, ladies and gentlemen. Half of my life I have spent in a communist regime, and half of my life I have spent in democratic republic. So I'm sure I have the right to have pretty realistic reflections of both. If I remember my youth, I was living as every teenager, a student, all over the world. I was attending school, I was attending the Young Communist summits, I was marching in the military parades. I was also listening to the stories about the Great Lenin. Half of my life I have spent in a communist regime, and half of my life I have spent in democratic republic. So I'm sure I have the right to have pretty realistic reflections of both. If I remember my youth, I was living as every teenager, a student, all over the world. I was attending school, I was attending the Young Communist summits, I was marching in the military parades. I was also listening to the stories about the Great Lenin. But when I came back home, I was reading books of my grandmother's library, published in a democratic state. I was reading books about history, I was reading books about geography, I was reading books about many important things which are important for the people who are educated and intellectual. So I was living like in an invisible cage, and I didn't know, because it was a cage around me, myself, my teachers, my friends, my parents, my family. So, still it was a life. The first time I saw the Berlin Wall was in 1976, when I was 21 years old. I was shocked. It was something surrealistic. We couldn't even imagine, with all these dark towers, fortification lines. We were trying as young people from Latvia, getting fun, making photos, like you young people do today, making selfies. And then our German students, our friends, became serious and said, don't do that. This is a danger to your life. And at that moment, I understood the existence of Iron Curtain. And it was not only Berlin Wall. The description of communist system was a border between the Soviet Union and Poland, about kilometer wide fortification line between two allies, military allies, ideological allies. This was something awful. I cannot understand today. But after the fall of Berlin Wall, all the Iron Curtains were gone, and we were all happy to live in Europe. And now most of us are the members of the European Union. And we have to say every day, European Union is a success story. Nevertheless, there are some doubts that it's not so successful, it has problems, it has made mistakes, whatever, not too strong enough. Yes, the problems exist, but if you look frankly to the history of the European Union, there has not been any step backwards in the development process, both political development and economical development. If we really compare the communist, or let's say post-communist Russia, with 2% of global GDP, to the Europe of nearly 25% of GDP, this is a big difference. But we don't speak about the figures, we speak about the emotions. And then I must say, I have a proposal to you all, Today, a lot of times, you mentioned in the post-communist countries. Let us not use this terminology anymore. But it shows some links to the communist world, to the communist ideology. We have to say, we are Europeans, we are democratic societies, we are democratic countries. That is a lack of confidence to call ourselves the post-communist countries and nations. We are not anymore. It's still, the reflections of that time, of the transition time. Ladies and gentlemen, the transition is behind us. It was about 20, 25 years ago. Today we have to work on development. And why the European Union is so successful? That's because this union is based on common values. A union of 28 nations, very different from the history point, very different by their culture, very different by the language, the traditions. They are successfully together as one of the world's strongest economic union. So I was really impressed today by the speech of Honorable former President of European Parliament, Mr. Pottering, when he said, we Germans will never forget what happened because of us during the 1933 to 1945. If the German person says that, what must be our answer? We have forgiven the German nation all the mistakes of the past. We have even forgiven the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, dividing Europe in two parts. We have forgiven everything what was done in the last century. We are in consolation as Europeans, as a European identity, which is very important, based on values, and very important to all of us. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about expectations, because if we reflect the 25-year-old history, we all had expectations. We were sitting in the kitchens with our friends, drinking wine, and trying to imagine how would the world will look like in 10 or 20 years, nothing to say beyond 25. Ladies and gentlemen, we have to acknowledge we have achieved much, much more than we expected 25 years ago. Who can expect that the President of the European Union would be a Pole? Who could expect that the Vice President of the European Commission would be a Latvian? Nobody. No Pole, no Latvian. They were happy about the Pope, but they never had any expectation that the Polish person would rule the European Union. So, but now about the expectations, let's say 5 years ago. The fall of Berlin Wall is celebrated 5 years ago and today, a few weeks ago. Now I try to quote the Russia's president of that day, Mr. Medvedev. Here in Berlin, I would like to say that we all hope that this period of confrontation has become a thing of the past. Today's transition to a new multipolar world is very important for most countries, for all European countries, and the entire world. And unifying agenda is very important for everyone as the planet continues to respond to the most dangerous threats, economic and regional ones, and our common fight against terrorism and crime. I hope that we have all rejected the divisive barriers which separated us in the past. Today, dear friends, we would like to work on this agenda together. Think about our children, our future, and common Europe. These are the words of the President of Russia 5 years ago. What do we have today? We all had nice expectations 5 years before. What we have today? We have a war in Europe. We have a total loss of confidence and trust between, EU and Russia, in Ukraine, And that's reality. What has changed in these 5 years? A lot. Right here, in the year in Bucharest, in 2008, during the Russia-NATO Council, the President of Russia, then it was Mr. Putin, just said, Ukraine is an official country. It has no right to exist, and it could be easily divided. 6 years ago, in the presence of heads of the states of 28 countries, ministers of defense, foreign ministers, a huge number of very influential people, nobody took it seriously. The same year, Russia left the Conventional Forces Europe Treaty. That was a treaty regulating the number of conventional armed forces in Europe. Just left. What was the answer from the Europe? We cannot do anything. If they are leaving, let's live without this treaty. And what we have a war today on this area. In the same year, here in Bucharest, we hesitated as a NATO to give a membership action plan to Georgia. A few weeks later, American President Bush was just silent in his negotiations with Mr. Putin. He didn't say no to war. A few months later, we had a war in Georgia. This is a history of the last 6 years. And now we see Crimea, eastern part of Ukraine, despite international treaties, despite the international law. If somebody violates the law, how it's called? It's called crime. And we have to be brave enough to say that's a crime. To violate the border of an independent state, in nowadays, that's a crime. But if we listen forward, the statement that Kazakhstan is a project of President Nazarbayev because Kazakhs never had a state. Should we believe that or not? Should we react on that or not? If somebody says that Riga, that's my capital city, Warsaw and some other, maybe Budapest and Bucharest, it could be easily occupied in a few weeks. What does it matter? According to above mentioned by myself, we have to take these sentences seriously because we are dealing with a country and with a president who delivers what he says. It's a nice idea. Are we ready? That's the question. So what has changed? Basically nothing has changed. We have changed. That's true. And now I like to quote another president. The president of my neighboring state, Estonia, Lennart Meri, from his speech when he was announced the man of the Europe. What he said. Russia needs 2 generations to recover from totalitarianism. And its greatest danger, the corruption inherited from the Soviet time, the hidden hindrance of the path of reformation. This has been the malady of Russia for centuries. We have underestimated the immense historic inertia of Russia, this immense country. Just because of its size, Russia has more land border and neighbors than any other country. This could be one of the reasons for Russia's insulation complexes that have lasted through the ages. The notion, long dead in Europe, that neighbors are dangerous by nature lives on in today's Russia. So the more neighbors, the more greater they have, greater are the danger. And all attempts by the neighbors to increase their security automatically mean undermining the security of Russia. Only a frightened neighbor is a secure neighbor. In its purest form, this centuries-old attitude obviously leads to a simple conclusion. Russia's troubles come from being too small, so it needs enlargement. The new way of Russia's enlargement has been announced in full voice by influential political movements and parties. And listen carefully, but not by the Russian government. This is a speech delivered in 1991, 15 years ago. And the only difference of today is that this is announced by the Russian government. Dear friends, what we can do in this situation? Really see that there is a dividing line between values and non-values. Because to talk about the morality is absolutely impossible in this case. What we have to do, we have to understand that we must contribute all our efforts of supporting the values, the democratic free choice of each individual, the democratic free choice of any nation. And if you just have a temptation to sign a document that we are deciding the Ukraine's fate in the future by excluding the Ukrainian people, just saying you must be there or you must be there, would be a greatest mistake by us. When we gave up, I'm finishing. When we gave up our values for the compromises which look like to have some gains in nearest future, the only thing we will create is more complicated situations in the future. Yeah. Thank you very much for your attention. Sorry for being so long.